Hey everyone, welcome to a new episode of Hope and Hard Pills. I am Alicia T. Crosby, and joining me today as co-host is Nandi K. Hey Nandi.
Hey, so excited to be here. Nice little guest spot.
I am super excited to have you here. So, everyone, Dre is on a break this week. And actually, will be on break for the next couple of episodes, but we're going to be introducing you to different members of the Hope and Hard Pills team who you may have seen their names before, but you haven't actually heard them. And so, this is an opportunity to get to know some of our team members a little bit better. But, Nandi, before we get into this episode, which is going to be amazing because we have interviewed like the super, super, super dope Rachel Ricketts. Let's tell our listeners a little bit about you.
Yeah, so I am the content coordinator over at Hope and Heart Pills. So some people might remember me from Hope and Heart Pills talks that we did last year. And then if you see any social, that's usually me on social. So yeah, I'm out here just kind of reminding the people that change can actually happen. It has happened, and just trying to keep everybody up on what they can do and why they should be doing it. So I'm super excited to join this kind of piece of the podcast because the Hope and Harples talks used to be great. And again, like obviously, like you said, Rachel Ricketts is super dope. So I'm super excited to talk specifically on this episode because she says so many things that resonate with me personally.
Same. Hard, same. As you know, our aim at Hope and Hard Pills is to provide practical insights for racial justice and social change. And Rachel definitely does that work today. So sit back, enjoy this interview with spiritual activist Rachel Ricketts.
No, it doesn't have to be. Doesn't have to be this way. Doesn't have to be. No, it doesn't have to be this way.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi.
Hey, thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Yeah, well, let's get into it. One thing that I notice for people who are doing anti-racism work online is that people think that that's all you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
So I wondered if you just describe your work for us.
Sure. I mean, this one's tough. How much time do you have? I'm Black, right? So I do 8 million things. Other than live on Instagram, which I'm honestly actively trying to spend as like the least amount of time on that racist platform as possible. I host anti-racism webinars and live workshops around the world. And I'm writing, currently working on my book proposal for a book that I hope will come out soon.
Sweet, yeah.
And just constantly speaking, creating content and writing about racial justice and the intersectionality between white supremacy and heteropatriarchy and the ways in which it specifically impacts Black and Indigenous women of color.
Yeah, I noticed that you're really working at that intersection, and I wondered if you could just comment on that some, because I know that it seems like, okay, so there's some people who, in focusing on racism, may miss some of the gender oppression that is involved there, and it seems like there are a lot of people in focusing on the patriarchy often miss the color line. So
white women.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just don't. I mean, I exist in a world as a Black woman, and so it is impossible for me to untangle patriarchy from racism. I can't parse out in a single instance of oppression or discrimination whether I am being more oppressed because I'm a woman or being specifically discriminated because I am Black. It is the intersectionality between those two things. And I happen to be straight and cisgendered, but I believe that all discrimination and oppression are linked. And we will not free any form until we have freed all forms. And so it is my duty, as having privilege of being a cisgendered straight individual, to also speak to the heteronormativity of the patriarchy and speak out and against all forms of oppression and discrimination. And so when I say women, I'm including gender, non-conforming, non-binary, trans, intersex, etc. And also speaking to the oppression faced by poor people, by differently able people, fat people, immigrants, certain religious groups, you name it. Like, we need to be addressing all forms of oppression and discrimination simultaneously.
So I notice that spirituality is a big part of what you're doing. Like, you have spiritual activism workshops and all this other kind of thing. And I wondered if you could talk to me about your commitment to spirituality in doing this work.
Yeah, listen, there's so many ways to do this work, right? And there's so many of us who are doing this work in so many different ways. And for me, it's that intersection of spirituality with activism. Like, I don't believe that you can be a spiritual person and not in some way, shape, or form be an activist. If you deeply feel that we are all interconnected and woven, and that my oppression is your oppression, then you best be doing something about my oppression. Because it's your own. Right. Whether you are facing it in this embodiment, in this lifetime, on this planet, in this moment, or not.
Right.
So I also really deeply believe that there's a time and space for us to analyze and to really move deeply into critique or a neck up understanding of what is going on in the world, what social justice is, what racial justice is about, and what's required. But I also deeply feel that there is a larger need at this point in time for a heart-centered, embodied approach, a way forward for us to be and move from compassion for ourselves, especially if you're oppressed, and for others. And if we can resonate with that through every cell of our body, with this understanding of our interconnectedness and this piece of us that's larger than ourselves, we can see things outside of ourselves. We have a larger capacity for empathy. We have a larger capacity for compassion, and therefore we have a larger capacity to actually implement changes for ourselves and for the collective.
Yeah, I hear that. I want to ask you more about that. Because I think it's surprising sometimes for me how often I run into, on many different levels, just different freedom fighters and activists throughout history who really do put an emphasis on what you're saying, the intangible part of this, the interior part of this. I'm just finishing up Malcolm X's autobiography, and I was just struck with his comments about his own self-transformation. And for me, someone who kind of feels a bit alienated from the spirituality that I grew up in. I grew up in Pentecostal Christianity, and it's been difficult for me to find my way back into like a spiritual connection, right? And so I wonder about other listeners that kind of have felt like, well, maybe they need to just be an out and out materialist to care about justice. And who hear this and go, I want a connection. I want the spiritual connection, but I don't even really know what that would look like for me. Like, what do you think how do you think you would respond to someone who feels like that?
That's a beautiful question. I think spirituality is deeply intertwined with our intuition, and with our like embodied human connection and physical existence on this earth, and a deep relationship with ourself. So my spirituality is not an organized religion, and I completely appreciate that there's a time and space for organized religion, and it works for a lot of people. And I also deeply appreciate that a lot of folks who grew up within an organized religion who they no longer identify with, or perhaps never did identify with. And so this notion of spirituality can get very tied up in that. Yeah. But I think spirituality is deeply personal at the same time as being entirely collective. So I would say for those listeners who are struggling with that connection or untangling maybe a former understanding or story or script around spirituality, is like, well, what lights you up and turns you on in terms of your connection with yourself? And what are your thoughts or wonderings about a higher self, What, it doesn't have to be a god or goddess. Just this notion of something that is larger than us. And I'm not even suggesting that you need to believe in that if that's not something you believe in, but just a curiosity around what your beliefs are around it. Because you might find you're actually deeply spiritual. You just haven't named it as such or thought about it in those terms.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Okay, we could talk about that all day, but I have more questions for you. Well, I guess I do have one more question about spirituality, because I just thought the phrase intersectional spirituality in your bio was so interesting. And I wondered if you could mention, what do you mean by that?
I mean, so many things. But I mean, mostly this notion, okay, so spirituality has been whitewashed, as has everything else, right? And so, when I was doing like strictly grief coaching work and death doula work, I was introduced to the what I call wealth and wellness industry, which is white and capitalistic and like so far from spiritual. I'm being judgmental, but yeah, I'm being judgmental.
You're addressing the grief. You're telling the truth.
Yeah. So, and it's sad that I feel like it needs to be said that like those words need to be required, like intersectional sense of spirituality. So I mean, culturally sensitive, non-appropriative spirituality that honors the communities that they're created by, the roots of the offerings, and the honest and integral intention behind what they were created for, which is connection. Connection for us to be seen, understood, and healed as and how we are, which is not what's going on in mainstream spirituality, right? Like people of color are being excluded from access to healing. And the majority of the modalities being taught were created by and for us.
Wow. Yeah, I'm kind of outside that world. But I have heard that kind of thing. I have a friend, Mickey Scott Bay Jones, and she just started doing some teaching around the Enneagram.
Oh, yeah.
And the reason why she started was because she felt, she was mentioning kind of what you're saying, is that she was like, there are no women of color or people of color that she knew of that were like popular Enneagram teachers, which is kind of crazy because it comes out of, Swana culture. It comes from ancient Muslims and Christians. I guess, like, is yoga an example of something that you're talking about? Like, because I know.
Prime example. Like the top, I talk about this a lot, the top yoga teachers are white. Oftentimes you're in a space, if you do yoga, I do it at home because I refuse to go into a studio because they're all appropriative. Not all, but majoritively, is that a word? Predominantly whitewashed. And the teachers are white and the students are white, and they charge an exorbitant amount that, costs out a lot of people. And it's violent. And that's what I call a form of violence. Spiritual bypassing. It is not honoring the roots. And like, how are there no major South Asian yoga teachers when it is a South Asian practice? That is just despicable.
Right. Yeah. No, that's crazy. No, I really appreciate the candor that you. I really do. I really appreciate the candor that you speak with, and I feel like Black women, especially, I follow a lot of Black women that are doing anti-racism work, and that is like I see a common theme there, and I admire it, really. So along those lines, you wrote an article, giving up on white comfort, and I wondered if you could talk about that some.
So I wrote this article the year I gave up white comfort, which was really a form of catharsis about like the grief and loss I was just speaking to about, leaving my community. So I'm in Sweden now. So it was the first time I left my community and was able, again, once you're actually outside of it, to really stand back and take a deep, honest, and a more objective view of like what's been going on and who people were and who you were in relationships to others. And so this is really my ode to that community, and that community specifically in a larger context, right? Of like kind of all white people everywhere. Truly. All white people everywhere, but especially the white folks who are the most attached to the status quo, which is white supremacy, who are the most, who are benefiting the most from white supremacist heteropatriarchy, therefore having the most power and privilege, meaning they're mostly predominantly liberal or like seemingly liberal and, you know, financially stable, if not like just downright fucking filthy rich. So this was my ode to them. And it was me being really clear for everyone, for myself and for everyone else about what my boundaries are and like what's required to engage with me. And I said it personally in my own context, because again, it was like a form of catharsis for me. But I also think in terms of a larger context of like how you can engage with people of color, specifically Black women, because I am a Black woman, so I'm always going to speak from my own personal experience first, to cause less harm, because white supremacy is causing people of color harm day in, day out. Every relationship that a person of color has with a white person includes harm because of the white supremacist heteropatriarchy that we live in. There's just no way around that. And so I do have close relationships with white folks, surprise. And those are the folks, you know, those are the folks who are doing their work and who are honoring those boundaries that I set out in that article. So it was a like kind of like cue Diana Ross, I'm coming out. It was like this is it. And this is like, you don't have to do these things. I'm not like going to stand here and point fingers at you. I'm just getting really clear about what's okay and what's not okay with me, because I've been subjected to so much violence my whole life, as have most people of color. And I'm just done as much as I can be, right? Like it's never going to be done. We live in a white supremacist world. It's global, but to the extent that I have control over my relationships, like these are my boundaries. I have boundaries with my father that I haven't spoken to in 5 years as well. Like I'm very clear about, with lots of therapy and inner work, I'm very clear about what works for me and what doesn't. And we're all adults. You can do whatever the hell you want, truly, you know, but I'm just saying like, okay, but if you want to like hang with me, this is where I'm at. And this is what is required for it to be a sufficiently safe relationship for me to engage.
Right. I think that a lot of non-Black people don't understand why that kind of boundary in particular, like to say, listen, I have a small circle of white people that I trust and that I consider friends, and that's necessary, right? And that giving up, you know, white comfort, especially if you're going to be telling the truth about race, you know, I don't think that it seems obvious, you know, from this side of the fence for me. But I feel like when I talk to different people that are not Black, that it's hard for them to wrap their brain around the legitimacy of doing that, the necessity of doing that. There was some other nice word that I wanted to throw out there that
Yeah, I hear that.
We've heard that you're born in Canada, you're living in Sweden, traveling a lot, and dealing with racism. People in America seem to think that racism only exists here.
I know. Well aware.
So what are you seeing as you travel from country to country, teaching about racism, anti-racism? Yeah, what do you observe oh gosh, there's so many ways to attack this, because I want to hear about your experience of anti-Blackness abroad for us, and also the things that you're challenging, the kind of pushback or the kind of challenges that you face in doing your work abroad.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I do think it's really important, and I explicitly address it as much as I possibly can in all of my work, that racism, white supremacy, anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity are global. And this hyper focus on America can be not only unhelpful, but harmful, like damaging, right? Because then there is this context by which the rest of the world's like, well, we're not America, and so we're good. We're fine. You know, and I'm Canadian, and so we are just your neighbor to the north. And there's the whole Canadian dialogue around racism, like we're the melting pot. You know, we are, and it's like literally a Canadian identity is essentially just like non-American identity, and it's a whole own thing. But there's this notion of like, but we are not racist because we don't see color. Color blindness is like a very Canadian phenomenon. what I'm going to call it because it's fucking imaginary. And so that's where I grew up. Like, but we don't see color. I never noticed you were Black. I literally had like a friend I've known for 20 years, obviously white, like 2 years ago, be like, I have to apologize to you because I never really like noticed you were Black.
I never noticed.
Like, what the fuck is this conversation? And she had just like, she felt good about herself, right? Because she's doing her work. Like, that's not doing work. I'm just standing like, what? Are you like, I've known you since I was 13. You didn't know I was Black because you're white and you don't have to notice all the ways in which this world treats me differently and oppresses and discriminates me day in, day out. And I don't talk about it with you because you're not a safe person to talk about it with. Anyways, I digress.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we're not friends anymore. But so Canada is this like, well, you know, or like, well, no one's ever called you a nigger, Rachel, so you can't say that racism exists here. No one's ever treated you differently. Or, I get this community that I come from is like, well, Rachel, she grew up with money. What is she talking about with this racism context? Like, oh, right. Because, you know, if you have money, you no longer face racism. First of all, no, I don't. Secondly, that ain't true. So Canada is this just, we're not the US, but we treat our Indigenous population, our First Nations population. They did a study, I think maybe 3 or 4 years ago now. And the side-by-side comparison statistically of how Canada as a nation treats its Indigenous population versus how America treats its Black population was worse. Side-by-side incarceration rates, suicide rates, poverty rates, et cetera, et cetera. And we just don't talk about it in Canada at all. There's no conversation about, you know, I think there's like 40 reserves in Canada that don't have clean water, that have had boiling water advisories for like 10, 20 years.
Yeah.
And that's just status quo. It's just not, you know, it's polite racism is what I call it, which is obviously not a thing, right?
Yeah.
But it's just not talked. It's just not even discussed. And so there was a part of me always growing up that I was like, but at least like America is this crazy place for sure with this really specific race relations experience. But I'm like, if you think I'm a nigger, I would just so rather you call me a nigger to my face. And so I know where you stand and I can like move from that as opposed to having to navigate my entire life being in spaces where people for sure looked at me as though I was a nigger and treated me as though I was one, but would never say it. And so there's nothing that you could point to.
Yeah.
I'm not saying one's better than the other. I'm saying my personal experience was always like, I wish there was something. And so Trump being elected for me was like, okay, well, what are you going to say about it now? You know, and the Make America Great Again hat. It's like, okay, you're calling me a nigger when you put that hat on. So I know where I stand with you. And
you know what you're getting.
You know exactly what you're getting. And I'm in no way, shape, or form trying to downplay. Like there's incredible violence happening, you know, physically, legislatively, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, for sure in the United States, without question. But I would say that has been happening forever, and it's just being brought to the surface now. And so, I could go on all day about, you know, Trump's necessity in terms of our collective rising.
Yeah, I was just about to say, I find it interesting that for someone who is not in America, that Trump's election and the MAGA hat and all that kind of stuff seems just as salient to you as it does to us. Oh, yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely. I never, and so here's the global context. There was never a distinction. For me personally, I'm Canadian, obviously, so it was really close, but there's never a distinction. When I see like Black people getting shot in the United States, there's no, I don't feel like, oh, well, that's an American. That's me. You are me. I am you. That's it. I don't care where you come from. I don't care if you call yourself African American, if you're Caribbean, if you're wherever. When you get to America and you have Black skin, that's it. And it's not that different in Canada. It's just not discussed. You know, we have police violence against Black communities. Toronto has a lot of statistics on that because that has the largest Black population again, right? I'm from Vancouver, so I was one of like 5 Black people. So it's not a lot that I can say because there's just not enough of us. But I assure you, if there were enough of us, it wouldn't look differently. So that's the Canadian context. Globally, I'm in Sweden. So this is deemed to be one of the most progressive liberal countries in Europe, if not in the world. And it ain't it. You know, like we're in a time where there's a resurgence of the alt-right globally, not just Trump, but Denmark isn't. So I live in Sweden, but I'm right next to Copenhagen. So I'm like in the suburbs of Copenhagen, which is a whole other thing. So I'm in Sweden and Denmark. And so Denmark is in the midst of an election, and they have like essentially like just a white supremacist fascist party that has a lot of support right now. Sweden has locked its borders. You know, they have been taking in a lot of refugees, a lot of migrants. I live in the most diverse city in Sweden, in the most diverse neighborhood, and it is quite diverse, way more diverse than what I was used to living in Canada. But it's, again, totally segregated. And because Sweden is this nation of like, you know, you can look at people immediately and seemingly be like, oh, you're Swedish or not based on the color of your skin. There is this total sense of otherness, you know, by virtue of being an immigrant of color. I feel it every day. And I get very concerned for my well-being when I walk around and I see like groups of white men specifically. I'm worried. There are daily instances of anti-Blackness and racism, religious persecution. They had an election right when I got here in the fall, or like late summer, early fall, and they also had a resurgence of an alt-right group, racist alt-right group. So again, I'm not trying to compare it to like mass police shootings of Black people, as is what's happening in the United States, but this notion of like, I keep joking like I'm searching for Wakanda, and it's really heartbreaking, honestly, to travel as much as I do and feel that anti-Blackness, that racism, that stench of white supremacy everywhere I go. My partner is mixed. He's part Filipino. And so when we think about where we want to settle down and have our children, where do we feel sufficiently safe doing that? Both having really harmful experiences growing up. Where we grew up, he grew up in Hawaii. You know, I don't know where that is.
Okay.
I don't know where in the world I feel safe as a Black woman, and where in the world I feel like my kids will be safe. I don't think there is a place. So it's just like, where can we feel sufficiently safe? And that's really heartbreaking. And like, white people and non-Black people don't really get that. It's hard for them to understand.
No. Yeah,
that
for sure.
that anti-Blackness is global. And so is anti-indigeneity, and it's across all races and cultures. That's why I advocate for Black and Indigenous women the most, because we exist at this intersection of both patriarchy and global cultural anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity, including within our own culture. It's just really heartbreaking.
I hear that. Yeah, it's so true that like you've hinted at a couple of times that even in our own communities, like, we have believed these anti-Black stories. We've subscribed to these anti-Black logics. And so, you know, as someone is listening and they say, well, wait a minute, you're a black woman, but there's nowhere in the world, like not even in majority Black countries, that you would say like that you feel safe. And it's like, well, I mean, my family is Jamaican.
Mine too.
Like fresh off the boat Jamaican.
My favorite kind.
And I can't say like I'll just go back to Jamaica, like, because in Jamaica they don't consider me Jamaican,
right? Me neither.
Because I was born in America, you know. Yeah, and you know, so thinking like, where are Black folks of the diaspora, you know, North American Black people, like, if you wanted to expatriate to somewhere, where could you go where people would say welcome home? You know?
Yeah. I don't think it exists. That we have to create our own homes. And so both my parents are Jamaican, and they left and they left. Like, they both separately left and met in Canada and married in Canada, and they never went back. Like, the trauma that they both individually endured in Jamaica, they're like, nah. Which was really hard for me as a first generation, like, you know, only Black kid in my whole white neighborhood. Like, I had no connection. And so when I finally did go back to Jamaica, though, I have to say, I was like, oh, yeah, no, this place is crazy. I get it. It's not, like, if you want to talk about patriarchy, like, holy shit. Which, again, this is really heartbreaking. You're like, oh, these are my roots. I'm going to like feel this connection and this sense of home. Like, nah, not at all. Not at all.
Yeah.
And so for me, first of all, I'm incredibly privileged to do the work I do and to travel the world, period. That's a privilege without question. I'm at a point, like I said, where we're trying to figure out, like, okay, well, where can we reside? And right now, you and I were talking before this, like, right now it's the US. And every time I say this to an American, they're like, are you insane? You must have bunked your head.
When you said that you're going to come here, that you and your partner are going to come here for a while, so we were off the air. Rachel said that she and her partner going to maybe settle in America for a little bit. I said, why would you ever come here?
And I hear that. But but there's at least enough diversity. And I mean that in terms of like not just races and ethnicities and cultures, but values and morals. And of all the places in the world that I travel these days, America, it has the largest gap. It's like a sliding scale, right? But America is the most attuned to this conversation. And so doing the work that I do, that's clearly where I'm the most needed. Obviously, it's also a dumpster fire. Like all the things that are going on are just absolutely insane. And so I also feel in a larger sense to where I'm most needed. But like selfishly, I also need to be in a place where I can nurture myself and have a sense of community that nurtures and nourishes me. And as of right now, I can only feel that space being in America. And I was talking about this with another Black activist who's American. And she was like, I don't know why you would ever want to live here, except from what you told me, I appreciate that like everywhere is a dumpster fire. And at least here there's other Black people that like get it, that get you. And I'm like, yeah, basically. Like there are lots of Black people in Sweden. There's a lot of Afro Swedes, but it is a different dynamic.
Right.
And it's that same, like, what I'm not African because I'm not. And I'm certainly not Swedish. And so I actually don't feel like we have a lot in common. Actually, I was at the train station the other day and waiting for the train, and this African man came up to me, just started talking to me. He showed me this photo and he was like, what is this? And I was, show me a photo of two men. And one of them was like dressed in a dress with a purse. And he was just so upset. And I was like, you are talking to the wrong person. Like, I was like, well, what's wrong with that? I just gave him like a whole gender like lecture. Essentially, he was just not expecting that from me, because he looked at me and was like, oh, there's no, like, we're both Black. I'm going to sit next to you and have this conversation and we have this mutual ground. And I'm like, nah, dog, we don't. We're Black, but we are having different experiences.
Yeah, no, I hear that. Well, we welcome you.
Thank you. Thank you. Trump does not, but yeah.
So how can people get in touch with you, learn, from the services and products that you are? I hate saying service and products, but I mean, they're not commodities, but but the offerings that you have for people to learn and grow in this area, where can they find that?
Yeah, thank you. So everything is located on my site, www.rachelricketts.com. And I have a shop there, and I hate that it's called a shop, but that's what it is. My workshops, my anti-racism workshops, Spiritual Activism 101 and 102 are offered there. And I have a workbook for getting spiritually activated to start the deep inner dive to be able to really authentically engage in racial justice work. So that's the primary space. I have all my articles and stuff live on that space. I also have a anti-racism resource list that is always growing, and I love the resources in your newsletter. I'm always so grateful to you, and those are so great. So yeah, I keep adding to that list, and a lot of them are there's quite a few now that you've sent me. So thank you.
I appreciate that. Yeah, thank you so much. Well, Rachel, it's been such a pleasure to talk with you and hear about your work and all of that. And I'm so excited to share this with the folks with the Hope and Hard Pills list.
Thank you. It's an honor. I really appreciate the work that you're doing, and to have this conversation. It was my pleasure.
No, it doesn't have to be. Doesn't have to be this way. Doesn't have to be. No, it doesn't have to be this way.
So, Nandi, I know that I got a lot from this episode. And hearing this interview and this exchange between Andre and Rachel. But I would love to hear your thoughts.
So she said so many things that kind of like resonated with me, and so did Andre. But kind of my big takeaways, obviously, number one is like that intersection of like racism and gender and oppression that she kind of sits at, and that her work is super focused on. I'm a gender queer, non-binary person, and I'm female bodied. So a lot of the things she said about that, specifically when she said that like the first traumatic things that happened to her were being born Black and being born a woman, that hit me like a ton of bricks. Like,
Mhm.
even like I grew up in church, and just to think about how it even
Mhm.
like operates in church, especially because she talks so much about spirituality. Um, just that piece right there of like how traumatic it is to be born black and a woman, just that existence on its own really was like, yes, I hear you. And even when you talk about like dealing with white women and like they love to kind of like
Mhm.
erase that black piece of like we're all
Mhm.
women, like, but like my issues are very
Mhm.
different than a white woman's issue. And I thought it was
Mhm.
really, yeah, I mean, that always super speaks to me because it's not the same. And a lot of white women kind of who
Mhm.
probably sit under this exact work that we do right now are like, well,
Mhm.
we're all women. They probably are guilty of this as well, of trying to like reduce an experience and just like not practicing nuance when it comes to that. So that was like a big thing that stuck out for me.
Now that definitely resonated with me too. I mean, it's actually the first note. So when we do these interviews, like I always like have like a page full of notes, and like the
Yeah.
first thing that popped out was about her speaking about our need to address all forms of discrimination
Right.
and oppression simultaneously. But that's the thing is like this addressing isn't from a place of distance for many of us.
Mm-hmm.
It's because we have these identities that are interlocked, and the modes of oppression that we deal with are also interlocked.
Right.
And so, I mean, I think it's a good thing for people to keep in mind. It's like this isn't just about like head knowledge of addressing discrimination. It's like what are you gonna do? Because like this has
Right.
very real effects for people.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like you said, it's that what are you gonna do? And she like, which was really great, she talks about how, like, it's an all of us problem, how, like, these problems are
Mhm.
interlocked, and it just reminds me of how, like, recently when Rihanna was accepting her NAACP award, she said this very similar thing, right, of, like, you have friends who are of other races and other genders, right? And they
Mhm.
wanna break bread with you, right? They like you, right? So this is also their
Mhm.
problem too, and I think that, like, a lot of white women, even ones who sit under this work and probably ones who, read Rachel Ricketts' writing, people probably who financially poured
Mhm.
into her as well, they're not moving past
Mhm.
that. And they're doing that thing of like, well, that's a black woman problem.
Mhm. And what's fascinating is that like this tension that you're talking about,
Mm,
right? Like this kind of casting off of people's responsibility. Like this isn't just an American thing. And I
right.
was very, very, very grateful for Rachel naming that. Like
Mhm.
the anti-blackness and specifically the anti-blackness that like black women face is
Yeah.
this is an international thing. Like Rachel's Canadian and Rachel's also
Right.
living abroad.
Right.
Um, and so these are encounters that she's had with people who are outside of the context of the US, which is true for some of our listeners. Like
Mhm.
anti-blackness isn't just a thing that happens in the US. It's just something that we actually happen to do particularly well here.
These are facts. Yeah, the whole like I always am like anti-blackness is global. Um People, I know that
Mhm.
the United States does have the US, it was like, I'm in tech. There's this thing called iterative design of like how you put out something
Mhm.
and you just keep perfecting it. Like racism in the US was tested like out for years. Like when you go
Mhm.
back, like when you think about even in Europe, how they tried to subdue the Scots Irish folks, moving forward to here,
Mhm.
indigenous folks. And then they said, you know what?
Mhm.
We need to displace people from their homelands and where they don't speak the language.
Mhm.
And that was what worked for them. Like, I know that it's a particular brand, but again, like we see it in France disguised as nationalism. We see it in
Mhm.
like Asia and Southeast Asia where it looks like colorism in some places. So it's always interesting to me to hear people who live abroad or even Canadians, like, I mean, Rachel's from Canada,
Mhm.
and how people kind of like think that Canada is some like racial, utopia. And I immediately think of Janaya, who has been doing work in Canada for a really long time. And if you ask Black people in Canada what's going on, they have a very different thing to say. So, like, this thought that,
Absolutely.
like, anti-Blackness is just a US thing is obviously coming from, like, color redacted white folks, you know?
It's not color redacted. But I mean, like, but what you're saying is like 100% truth. Like, I think one of the things that she mentioned having a conversation with a now former friend,
Mhm.
um, on that whole like colorblind nonsense, right?
Child.
A thing that's very popular to say, and I thought that it was just a US thing. Apparently not. Um, but where people are like, I never noticed that you were black. I never saw your skin color.
The lies.
Like,
The
wait,
lies.
what?
Like, it's like,
Like the
ma'am,
pure lies. It's like, how do you not notice another person's particularities? Like, and
listen,
why, if that is actually true, which I don't believe it is, but like, why is that a thing that people like think is of value? To say that, hey, what is particular about you, what is unique about you, I don't actually see that.
child. Well,
Like, what's the game there?
I wonder what the game is, but for me, when people say stuff like that, it's just like you're telling on yourself. Because, like, if you have to erase my blackness to see me as like the same as you're a racist.
Mm-hmm.
Period. It's
Mm-hmm.
like, I see. So you're a racist, is what you're saying. Oh, you didn't notice I was black because that makes you uncomfortable? You didn't notice I was black
Mm-hmm.
because do you need to like go to the doctor and get your eyes checked? Like, is it a medical issue? Can you not see my black skin? Because to me, it makes me wonder, like, where do you live at? Is it some bird
Mm-hmm.
box situation? Um,
Not
it's
bird
just I have a
box.
I just I just have a lot of questions when people say, but also like a lot of answers come right from that. Okay, you don't see black people as equal because you had to erase my blackness to see me as equal or see me however you see me. You need to erase
Mm-hmm.
differences to find solidarity, which is, you know,
Mm-hmm.
that's problematic. It just says a lot of things
Mm-hmm.
about kind of like ignorance and about kind of where they
Mm-hmm.
stand. Even if they say, they're allies, like someone who's an ally would never say, I don't see color.
Well, yeah, because if you don't see color, you don't see like the things that I'm up against in the world.
Right.
And I don't need people like on my team who refuse to see not just like the beauty of the particularity, right? Because like there is beauty in culture and in in our melanin, like
Mm-hmm.
it's awesome. But also like there are some very real consequences to being black or Asian or
Right.
indigenous or
Yeah.
Latinx and Hispanic. Like they're very real consequences to our realities or lived realities as people of color. And when you tell us that you don't see skin color, that you don't notice that we are insert marginalized personhood,
Mm-hmm.
that you're
What else?
saying that you
Yeah.
don't see the way that the world bears down on us, which means you
Right.
also don't see our liberation.
Mm. Listen, it constantly baffles me that this kind of thing is like still coming up in 2020 and like that people are still saying
Hmm.
they don't see color of this like whole like whitewashing of identity just like in
Hmm.
general. And yet when I show up to a space where I'm the only black person, I'm painfully aware, right? And also the people
Hmm.
who are there are painfully aware that I'm black and very different than everyone else who's there. So I'm
Hmm.
glad she brought that to light just on a global scale because I think that it's really important that a lot of people who are maybe like, on the fence about its racial injustice. Hopefully,
Hmm.
that kind of thing will open their eyes up and say, it's not just the US, it is Canada, it is Sweden where she lives right now. Because when she said that she has like this fear of groups of white men, whoa,
Hmm.
I felt
Yeah.
that so hard. Like, and she's living in
Yeah.
Sweden, which is like white. Also, like that dynamic of Afro Swedish people to like Black American people that
Hmm.
she brought up was really interesting too, because it just speaks to, like, how Blackness is not a monolith and even how we, like, relate to racism is different,
Hmm.
like, abroad. Like, I know, like, I always talk about France because like, how they use nationalism as, like, a cover for
Hmm.
racism. But also, like, here in the
Hmm.
US, when you meet continental Africans and sometimes even Caribbean people, we don't have
Hmm.
well, at least her story about the guy on the train who was like, "You see this man in a dress?" Like, I'm her in that situation where Black people
Mm-hmm.
come up to me with their, like, some of these, like, maybe more, like, bigoted views that have nothing to do with race. Maybe it's about gender presentation, and they were like, "This man is wearing a dress," and I'm like, "Wow, you're threatened. Let me just school you
Mm-hmm.
real quick about it." I thought that was really interesting too.
Absolutely. You know how this goes. Like I ask questions. I'm a professional question asker. It's what I do.
Yes.
Um, but I mean, there's consideration that we have to do around what forms our spirituality, right?
Mhm. Right.
So for Rachel, hers is a heart-centered, embodied approach that like is connected to empathy.
Mhm.
Um, but what are some of the things that shape your spirituality?
Yeah, I think that empathy is probably the biggest, like, heart centered. That really resonated with me with Rachel, just because it really is for me the heart of people, and just not even necessarily putting myself in their shoes, but that's what empathy is, I guess, of just saying, like, how would I feel if that was me? I talk a lot about for me, I like Black trans women is the hill that I will die on, and so, like, that intersection of gender and I grew up in church, so, like, when I think of spirituality, I just think of, like, how I've divorced myself from dogma. I've divorced myself from
Mhm.
kinda this God that has a specific identity, because if God is, like, all-encompassing, God either is all or not. So a lot of the work that I do is definitely motivated by empathy and by just I think people have the right to exist as they choose, as long as it doesn't hurt people, like, obviously I don't want no murderers running around, but people should be able to be who they are and not feel afraid, like that fear of and, like, when she talks about white comfort, like, that fear of speaking
Mhm.
up, that fear of not being yourself, that wears on your spirit as well, and can break your
Mhm.
spirit if you feel unable to be who you are. And especially just with,
Mhm.
like, mental health crisis, just, like, rate on the rise for people, and someone who struggles with things myself, not being able to be who
Mhm.
you are, just it wears on you. It's what is the point of life if you're living for someone else's gaze?
Ooh.
Mm, I just
Oh
think
goodness.
if I was living for how white people see me, if I was living for how straight people see me, it's just where do I find things for myself?
Mhm.
And what is the point of
Mhm.
your life if you're not finding things for yourself?
Mhm.
Mm,
So let's talk about some of those finding things for yourself, right?
mhm.
One of the things that like Rachel pointed to in her time in conversation with Andre is thinking about like what lights you up and gives you connection to yourself. Like what are those things for you?
For me, it's music. I'm about to like start doing music, and I find a lot of black people that are black artists, musicians that I love, they did this work too through their music. Like Donny Hathaway is one of my favorite
Mm.
people, and he threw
Mhm.
himself into, doing things for black folks to feel empower like they were worth something. And that whole group, I mean, that whole group of people that kind of like came through the 70s, Marvin Gaye, Donny Hathaway, Aretha Franklin, Nina Simone, like people who took that talent, that thing that gave them joy, and used it for the greater good to just like say what black people are thinking, give voice to these things that were in our heads, like I think of like this reprise of Donny Hathaway's Little Ghetto Boys. Everything has got to get better. Like for me, that is because things
Mm.
are better from when Donnie was here. You know, like things
Yeah.
are better from when Donnie was here. So that's the stuff that lights me up. Like black art, like Black expression because we were so repressed for so long. Being able to really express myself creatively and is honestly like the only reason I live.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Are there any other things that you want to touch on during
Mm,
our time?
I did kind of just want to talk about how she talked about Trump being elected. Um we're in an election year, and so feelings
Mhm,
around the presidency are high. We're seeing all these debates, and I actually was having a conversation with
mhm.
some people about Trump being elected and just like how I didn't really feel anything.
Really?
It didn't scare me that Trump was elected. As soon as he was
Mhm,
like in the running, I knew that there was a huge possibility that he might win. And
mhm.
that's just, based on my experience of the world as a Black person. I'm like, there's a lot of people who believe this, everything that Donald Trump is saying. I'm from the South, and I'm like,
Mhm.
yo, like I like my races where I can see them. So when Donald Trump got elected, I always tell my friends, I'm like, I wasn't sad because doesn't. I mean, Black people have lived under worse presidents. But when she talked about like
Yeah.
kind of this election thing and like how she didn't feel that much, it didn't seem that different to her. That really resonated with me just because I think that there was a lot of. I mean, I'm sure you remember how sad people were the day after the election,
Mhm,
particularly white
mhm,
liberal people, white women, and I don't know if this happened to you,
mhm.
but there was a lot of people coming up to me being
Yeah.
like, "Yo, I'm so sorry. Things are gonna get so much worse."
Yeah.
And I felt
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
disrespected.
Yeah.
I was like, do
No,
you live here?"
yeah. I mean, I think if nothing else, like, the 2016 election showed the ways in which people were, unaware of what some of us had been going through.
Mhm,
Actually, recently, had done a live tape-in of another podcast, and the other guest, as we were wrapping the show, the hosts were asking us questions about, like, what we were hopeful for or
mhm,
whatever, and or what we would say actually in response to people's hopelessness, because that had been
mhm.
a thing that had been
Right.
shared with their listeners.
Yeah.
And I remember just saying, like, I feel hopeful because I mean, as much as like this season sucks, we are able to see the ways in which it has sucked for a number of different groups of people. And
Yes.
out of us seeing that things have not been good for one another, we can come to new understandings of like what the world could and should be in like mitigating that and
Mhm.
addressing those things and caring for each other, extending empathy and using the tools of like our particularity to get to that place.
Right.
And the other host, or not the other host, but the other guest, on the show, he shared something, like, akin to, like, "I'm not hopeful, like, it's just hard, but, like, you know" oh, what was it? I can't even remember 100% what it was, but it was just, like, it's just such a dark time, and it's just, like I mean, and this is a person, like, who, is a white man,
Mhm.
and I had to be like, "Bruh, like, you're sitting here talking about how bad it is, you just got here." Like, you're
Mm.
just feeling the press as a liberal white man, like, one of the things that, like, sometimes I think about is, like I think it's, like, spiritual sometimes,
Mhm.
and or, like, old church songs, and, like, one that came to mind in that moment was "We Come This Far by Faith." Like,
Yes,
I
that's
am
a good
a
one.
product of the Black Baptist Church. It's like,
Amen,
we've come this
same.
far by faith, like, leaning on the
Lean on the
Lord.
Lord.
Like,
Yes.
we've we've been through some stuff,
He's never
and
failed me
so
yet.
in the
Oh my
middle
god. Yes.
never. I think about like this is again the ties to the ancestry.
Mhm.
Like knowing what my grandma, what my great grandparents, my great greats, to the point that I have understanding of like my family lineage, because some of that's been cut off for me by
Mhm.
things like white supremacy. But extent that I know that we made it this far where I'm in this present moment because of what we survived.
Right.
And so that is something I can take hope in because they pressed on, and that means that I can press on.
Yeah.
And it was just an interesting moment where it's just like we've got 2 very different realities. It's like, for you, this presidency was devastating. It's not that it doesn't It's not that it's not without its challenges. It is. Like, people are struggling and struggling in ways like, I appreciated what you just said in terms of, like, liking your racist where you could see them.
Yeah.
I think that there's so many things that were systematized before that the blatant, just, like, not giving a crap of this current administration has
Mhm.
allowed for the veneer to drop. And
Yes.
so it's like we're now seeing, like, the man bot like, behind the screen, right? We see the wizard,
Mm.
where before we just heard the voice.
Woo.
Um,
Yeah. So good.
and but that encourages me because we can see how small people are and how scared they are
Yeah.
and how fear is what motivates their decisions and ignorance and in that same way, for people who are on, like, kind of that precipice of, like, trying to figure out what they do and are struggling with the fact that they are incredibly privileged but don't like to hear it because of, like, what that drums up in them.
Mm.
Like, there are ways that we can live into the world where by people seeing us just live and create and, like, survive and
Yeah.
also work towards thriving in the midst of this all, maybe, just maybe, they'll also find encouragement to press in and to press on and to, like, abdicate that privilege, to abdicate and walk away from, like, the ways in which they were harming other people. And because they
Yes.
see it actually does affect them.
Yeah, now they do. Yeah, I think of when you said, "We've come this far by faith," it also makes me think of "Lift Every Voice and Sing," because it just talks
Mm.
about, like, sing of the song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Just I love
Mhm.
being Black. It's hard. It is
Mhm.
so hard, but just like I mean, and not to glorify resilience because obviously, like, if we had a choice, we wouldn't go through all this strife, but just the resilience of
Mhm.
Black folks, and it's like you said, like, these people who are like, oh, just now getting here and realizing, and now you hear people, especially since the 2016 election, being like, listen to Black women. You see way more people being like, a Black woman should
Mhm.
be president, and that's problematic also.
Mhm.
But at least we're
Mhm.
seeing a shift towards whose experiences are kind of being listened to, even if it's on a small scale right now. A shift is definitely happening where white people are like, "Wow, I had no idea." And then they're moving to, okay, some people did have an idea. Let me listen to those people.
Mhm.
And that brings us people like Rachel Ricketts, you know,
Mhm.
who there are people
Mhm.
who are like, I need to listen to Black women. I need to listen to
Mhm.
these marginalized voices who've been living this for so long and figure out what I can do and what the best way is to do it.
Mhm.
So I feel hopeful too. I
Mhm.
said at least, the United States is being honest, and that's how I felt. It was the most honest representation of the presidency and of the US government that I think we have had in a long time.
I concur, and I think out of that place of honesty, we're able to really look at possibility.
Mm,
And
yeah.
that's what my hope lies in. I mean, I know this is hope and hard pills, and for some of y'all, like, some of these pills that got delivered in this recording
Mhm.
will be a little difficult for you to swallow, but at the same time, like, hope still abides,
Yeah.
and I hope, not to, like, overuse the word, but hope
Mhm.
that you'll, like, take encouragement in knowing that, like, we see how change could come. We see
Yeah.
how social transformation can occur, but it's in looking at the possibilities that lie in the examples of those of us who have survived and endured and who
Mhm.
have been resilient, um, and just show the world like what possibility lies in like
Yeah.
being who you truly are.
Yeah, a new world is possible. It doesn't have to be this
Hmm.
way, you know? It's just all
Mm,
what we're all
it
about
doesn't.
here. It really doesn't, and a new world is possible. Yeah.
I think that that's a great note to end this particular conversation on. Nandi, I am so grateful that you chose to spend time with us today. Like, it means a lot. And I'm really excited for our listeners to hear more of your incredible, thoughtful, inspired voice soon.
I hope so. Yeah, definitely looking forward to it.
So, y'all, you know that we ask questions in every episode, and here's your rundown of this week's questions. What forms of repression do you call out or point to as being an issue? What activated you in working to address these issues? What beliefs or ideas give shape to your spirituality? What were you brought up to believe? What do you choose to believe? How does your spirituality come into contact with or impact your justice-seeking work? What lights you up and gives you life in your connection with yourself? What are your thoughts or wonderings about yourself and what lies outside of yourself? Given that your energy is finite, who do you dedicate it to as you work for change in yourself and in the world? Who doesn't get your energy? Who do you want to give more of your energy to? So again, thank you for joining us for another episode of Hope and Hard Pills. I'm Alicia Crosby.
And I'm Nandi K.
And we've been really glad to have you with us this week. Thank you to our wonderful supporters, our patrons who are sharing their resources with us in order to make this show possible. If you want to join this team of supporters, stay tuned. Our producer, Ross McHenry, will be sharing information on how to support what we do here at Hope and Hard Pills. Until next time.
We're not living in your fantasy. Your Daffy Duck and your Bugs Bunny. Wearing clothes that we cannot.
Thank you for listening today. If you like what you heard and you haven't already, please subscribe on your favorite podcatcher. Leaving a rating or review on Apple Podcasts also helps us get into more ears and minds. This podcast is made possible by our fantastic patrons. Thank you for being a part of our work at Hope and Hard Pills. As usual, you'll get the uncut extended version of this episode on Patreon. If you want to join in the work on our Patreon community, just look us up at patreon.com/Andre Henry. To go deeper, get subscribed to our email newsletter. Head over to andrerhenry.com and click Join the Movement, where you'll get practical insight on anti-racism and social change every week. And you'll never miss a new article, song, or podcast episode. You can also follow Andre Henry on Facebook and Instagram at The Andre Henry. Connect with Alicia on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Alicia T. Crosby and her website, aliciatcrosby.com. That's all for this episode of the Hope and Hard Pills podcast. See you next time. Peace.